On a Tuesday morning in October of 2019, Marcus Del Vecchio stood on the edge of a grain storage facility outside Ottumwa, Iowa, and watched 2 years of planning turn to rot in front of him. He was 44 years old, and he had spent the last decade building one of the most successful mid-scale grain storage and transport operations in Wapello County. 3 facilities, 11 employees, contracts with 4 regional co-ops, and a direct pipeline to a processing plant in Burlington that bought more corn in a single quarter than most family farms produced in 3 years. He was, by every measure a man of his background could imagine, a success story. The problem was the grain. Let me tell you about what Marcus had done, because you need to understand the ambition before you can understand the failure. In the spring of 2018, Marcus had expanded his main facility by 40%. 2 new storage bins, each holding 80,000 bushels, a second pneumatic conveying system, and a commercial grain dryer that had cost him $340,000 installed and running. He had done it on credit, against projected forward contracts, because the analysis said commodity prices were trending up, and anyone who had storage capacity in the next 18 months was going to make serious money. That analysis wasn't wrong, exactly. It was just incomplete. What the analysis hadn't accounted for was an August that delivered 11 inches of rain across southeast Iowa in 14 days, followed by a harvest season where moisture content in the incoming corn ran 5 to 8 points higher than the projections. His dryer was a good machine, but it was sized for the old facility. Running it continuously against this volume, at this moisture content, pushed his throughput to its limit, and his per-bushel drying cost passed what the contracts would bear. So Marcus had made a decision that good businessmen sometimes make and almost always regret. He had accepted storage contracts on 60,000 bushels of corn that came in at 18% moisture and stored it at 15.5%, 2.5 points wetter than the standard threshold for long-term storage, with the intention of running it through the dryer in rotation before any spoilage could develop. He had been wrong about the timing. By the first week of October, 2 of the bins were showing elevated CO2 readings, which meant microbial activity, which meant heat pockets, which meant the grain was spoiling from the inside. He'd pulled samples. He'd called his agronomist, and he'd had 2 separate grain quality specialists out to the facility who had given him the same assessment in different words. The grain was compromised. Not all of it. Maybe 40% of what was stored was still within acceptable quality parameters if he moved it immediately. But the other 60%, somewhere between 35,000 and 40,000 bushels, had crossed a line. The processing plant in Burlington didn't want it. The co-ops didn't want it. One of his 3 contract holders had already sent a letter through their attorney suggesting that delivery of non-conforming grain would constitute a breach. His options, as laid out by his attorney on that Tuesday morning call, were not good ones, and he could attempt to blend the compromised grain into the acceptable inventory and hope the testing at the receiving end didn't catch the spread, and that option was not just financially dangerous, but the kind of thing that ends careers and occasionally ends in criminal charges. He could attempt to find a livestock feeder who would take damaged corn at distressed prices, maybe 40 cents on the dollar if he was lucky, which would cover roughly a third of the contract shortfall. Or he could declare force majeure on the affected contracts, take the legal fight, and spend the next 2 years in litigation while his reputation in Wapello County dissolved. He was standing at the facility gate on that October morning. phone in one hand and a coffee he hadn't touched in the other, when the truck pulled off the county road. Let me tell you about Elias Greer, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he offered. Elias was 78 years old, and he had farmed the same 320 acres in rural Mahaska County for 52 years. His farm sat 7 miles north of Marcus's facility, and the two men knew each other the way men in small Iowa counties always know each other. Enough to wave, enough to stop at the same table at the co-op once or twice a year, not enough to have ever sat down for a serious conversation. Elias had come to that land as a 26-year-old with his wife Helen, who had died in 2009, and he had spent those 52 years building a farm that wasn't large by any modern measure, but was, by the assessment of every neighboring farmer who paid attention, nearly perfectly managed. He had made it through the farm crisis of the 1980s without losing an acre. He had made it through 3 separate commodity price collapses without missing a loan payment. He had a reputation in the county, not for being brilliant exactly, but for being someone who had seen enough and thought enough that he rarely made the same mistake twice. What most people in the county also knew, though fewer thought much about, was that Elias had been storing grain since 1973. Not at the commercial scale that Marcus operated. His bins were his own, 3 of them, 2 older steel bins and 1 concrete stave silo he'd built in 1981, and his methods were not anyone's methods but his own. He had spent 46 years moving grain through those bins, monitoring moisture, managing temperature, or watching CO2 levels with instruments that his son had called outdated in 2012 and that Elias had been using correctly ever since. He had a notebook, not a spreadsheet, not a software system, a paper notebook with a red cover that contained entries on every storage cycle he had run since 1978. Every moisture reading, every temperature anomaly, every intervention. 41 years of grain storage data in his handwriting on lined paper. He had been driving past Marcus's facility for the last 3 weeks on his way to the co-op, and he had been watching. His truck came to a stop at the gate, and Elias lowered the window, and Marcus walked over with the expression of a man who had not slept well and was not prepared for conversation. Elias looked at him for a moment without speaking, and then he said, "I think I know what's happening in those bins." Marcus told him, briefly and without optimism, and Elias nodded the way old farmers nod at information they already have. "You've got a segregation problem," Elias said, "and a time problem, but not necessarily the problem you think you have." Marcus looked at him. How much of it tested over 20% moisture on intake? Marcus thought about it. Maybe a third of the compromised inventory. The rest came in between 17 and 19. Elias nodded again. "Come, show me your temperature cables. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched someone arrive at a problem you had been inside for 3 weeks and start asking the right questions within 5 minutes? It's a specific feeling. It's not comfortable exactly. Or it's the feeling of realizing that the frame you've been using to understand your problem was the wrong frame, and that someone else, someone you barely know, someone who pulled off a county road in a truck that was older than your business, has a different frame entirely." Marcus Delvecchio was not a man who accepted help easily. He had built his operation alone, on his own credit, against the advice of 2 separate bank officers who had said the expansion was too aggressive. He had a particular kind of pride that men who build things from nothing often have. Not arrogance exactly, but a settled confidence in his own assessment that made it difficult to hear someone else's assessment as anything other than implicit criticism. He showed Elias the temperature cables. Elias walked the bins, so he asked to see the CO2 readings for the past 3 weeks. He stood in the equipment shed for about 10 minutes looking at Marcus's drying system, and he asked 4 or 5 questions about airflow and plenum pressure that Marcus answered honestly and that Elias received without comment. Then they walked outside, and Elias looked at the sky for a moment, which Marcus later said was the strangest part, and then he turned around. "You have a layer problem, not a total spoilage problem," Elias said. "Your hot spots are at the 8 to 14-foot depth in 2 of the bins. Below that, you've got grain that's salvageable if you move it in the next 10 days. Above and around the hot zones, your moisture is still inside the window for distressed sale to a livestock buyer. The issue is that nobody has moved this grain since intake, and it's stratified. Your CO2 readings are scaring you into thinking the whole bin is compromised, but CO2 doesn't diffuse evenly in a standing grain mass. You're reading the worst pockets, not the average condition." Marcus said, "The specialist told me the grain was compromised." Elias said, "The grain in the hot spots is compromised. The grain around the hot spots is stressed. Those aren't the same thing. And the grain at the bottom, below the thermocline, is probably fine. How deep is your reclaim auger reach?" He had Marcus there. The reclaim system was designed for flow, not for selective depth extraction. You couldn't pull selectively from the lower zones without disturbing the upper mass, which would spread the compromised material through the bins. Elias listened to this and said, "I know. That's why you need a different approach." Let me tell you what Elias proposed, because it was not anything Marcus had been offered by the specialists or the agronomist or the attorney. Elias had, on his farm in Mahaska County, a piece of equipment that most commercial grain operations hadn't thought about in 30 years. It was a grain spreader and layer sampling rig that he had built by hand in 1984, based on plans he had found in an old Extension Service publication from the 1960s. It allowed him to extract grain from specific depths within a bin without disturbing the surrounding mass. Essentially, a targeted extraction device that worked on differential pressure rather than mechanical auger force. It was not elegant. It was not fast. It was built from steel pipe, a modified centrifugal blower, and an airtight intake manifold that Elias had fabricated himself in a shop behind his barn. It weighed 340 pounds and moved on a shop-built dolly. No manufacturer made it. No dealer stocked parts for it. The only reason it existed was that Elias Greer had needed it in 1984, when he had a similar stratification problem in his own bins, and had decided to build it rather than lose the grain. Marcus's foreman, a 38-year-old named Pete Sorensen, who had been running grain operations for 15 years, walked into the conversation at this point and listened to the description of the device with an expression Marcus later described as politely skeptical. Pete said, "So you're saying you can extract from specific depths without cross-contaminating the surrounding inventory?" Elias said, "In my bins, yes. Whether your bins will cooperate is a separate question. But the physics don't care about the bin size." Pete said, "No offense, but that kind of device would have been in circulation if it actually worked that way." Elias looked at him without any particular expression. Then he said, "It worked in 1984, and it's worked every time I've needed it since. You can drive out and look at it, or you can keep doing what you're doing." There was a silence. Marcus said, "Bring it out. Let me tell you about the next 2 days because they are the reason this story gets told the way it gets told in Wapello and Mahaska counties, in the diners and at the co-op desks and in the corners of auction barns when men who were there start talking about what they saw. Elias's son, David, drove the rig out on a flatbed trailer on a Wednesday morning, and what arrived at Marcus's facility was not impressive to look at. It was a collection of fabricated steel components, pipe fittings, a blower housing that had been repainted at least twice, and a dolly system that had been welded and re-welded in places with the confidence of a man who had fixed things many times and expected to fix them again. Pete Sorensen looked at it and said nothing. Two of Marcus's other employees said nothing either, though they said it in a way that communicated something. Elias and David spent 4 hours in the setup. They did not rush. They ran pressure tests on the intake manifold. They calculated the extraction rate against the bin diameter and grain density. Elias made adjustments to the manifold depth setting using measurements from Marcus's bin drawings, which he had asked for the day before and had studied that evening at his kitchen table. At one point, he asked for a piece of graph paper, and he sat on the tailgate of his truck and drew a diagram of the extraction pattern, showing Marcus exactly what the device would pull and from where and why the surrounding mass would not migrate into the extraction zone if they maintained the right differential pressure. Marcus stood and watched. He had been in grain operations for 15 years. He had been to trade shows in Des Moines and Indianapolis. He had $340,000 of commercial drying equipment 40 yards from where he was standing. He watched a 78-year-old man draw a diagram on graph paper and explain a principle he had never encountered in 15 years of professional practice. At 2 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon, they moved the rig to the first bin. The extraction began slowly. That was the first surprise. There was no dramatic machinery sound, no roar or shudder. The blower ran at a specific speed. Elias had set it by ear. David later told Marcus, by a pitch he knew from 40 years of running the device, and the grain began to move through the intake manifold in a thin, controlled stream. Elias watched the manifold pressure gauge the whole time. He adjusted the gate twice in the first hour. He called David over once to check a fitting. He did not appear hurried or anxious. He had the affect of a man completing a task he had completed many times, which was exactly what he was. The grain that came out in the first 4 hours was compromised. Nobody pretended otherwise. It went into a separate pile in the equipment bay, tagged and isolated, ought to be disposed of at distressed pricing to a livestock buyer Elias said he already knew in Davis County. But then, at about the 6-hour mark, the grain coming out of the intake changed color slightly, from the gray-tinged flat finish of stressed corn to a cleaner, more consistent yellow, and Elias stopped the machine and took a sample and handed it to Marcus. Marcus looked at it. He took out his moisture meter. 15.1%, he said. Elias nodded. Below the thermocline now. Let me tell you about the next 4 hours, because this is where the physics that Elias had drawn on graph paper became something Marcus and Pete Sorensen could not argue with. The grain coming out of bin 1 below the thermocline tested between 14.8 and 15.4% moisture consistently. It was not compromised. It had not been compromised. And it had been sitting beneath the problem, insulated by the grain mass above it, protected by the same stratification that had made the upper layers dangerous. When Elias had said it was a layer problem and not a total spoilage problem, he had been right. Not as an optimistic estimate, but as a statement of grain physics that 46 years of storage management had given him the ability to read from temperature cables and CO2 readings that had told a different story to everyone else. They worked through Wednesday evening and into Thursday. David Greer slept in his truck. Elias went home at 10 p.m. and was back at 6 a.m. with coffee and without ceremony. By Thursday afternoon, they had processed both compromised bins, and the final tally was not painless. 22,000 bushels of compromised grain that would sell at severe discount, but 41,000 bushels of grain that tested within standard parameters, grain that Marcus had been told by 2 specialists was effectively lost, was now sitting in 2 clean, properly aerated bins at acceptable moisture content. The processing plant in Burlington took the first call on Thursday evening. The contract holders received revised delivery schedules on Friday morning. The attorney was informed that the force majeure letter would not be necessary. Marcus Delvecchio sat in his office on Friday afternoon and did an accounting. The distressed grain sale would net him roughly 38 cents a bushel on the compromised inventory. A loss, but a recoverable one. The salvaged grain would fulfill his contracts at full contract price. At the total financial damage, which had looked like potential ruin a week earlier, was now something he could absorb over the next 18 months without losing any of his facilities or his contracts. He had not been saved entirely. He had been saved enough, which was all that the situation had ever required, and which was something that no one with commercial equipment or professional credentials had been able to tell him. He drove to Elias's farm on Saturday morning. Elias was in the shop behind his barn, running a weld bead on something Marcus didn't recognize, and he turned off the welder and lifted his hood and looked at Marcus without surprise. Marcus said, "I owe you more than I can pay you." Elias said, "You don't owe me anything." Marcus said, "I want to pay you. Name a number." Elias thought about this. He said, "Send a check to the Mahaska County Extension Office. They're trying to keep the grain storage program funded. $1,000 would help them." Marcus wrote the check that afternoon for $3,000. But that's not what Marcus wanted to understand. He stayed for 2 hours in Elias's shop, and he asked questions, and Elias answered them with the patience of someone who had been waiting a long time for someone to ask. He talked about moisture stratification, about the difference between CO2 as a diagnostic tool and CO2 as a sentence, about the ways that commercial grain storage had optimized for throughput and lost something in the exchange. The willingness to work slowly, to read what was actually there rather than what the instrumentation summary suggested, to trust accumulation of knowledge over novelty of equipment. He talked about the extension publication he'd found in 1983, and the winter he'd spent building the extraction rig in his shop, and the 7 or 8 times he'd used it over the decades, always on his own grain, always with the same patience. Marcus asked, "Why didn't you sell this? License it? Get it manufactured?" Elias said, "It's not faster than the commercial systems. It just works on problems the commercial systems can't touch. Who are you going to sell that to?" Marcus didn't have an answer, and after a moment he said, "I should have asked you 3 weeks ago." Elias said, "Yes, but you wouldn't have listened 3 weeks ago. You had to run out of options first." This was true, and Marcus knew it was true, and he didn't say anything in response. Let me tell you what happened over the next 5 years, because the story doesn't end at Marcus's facility. Marcus Delvecchio changed some things about how he ran his operation. Nothing dramatic, no press release, no public announcement. He hired a part-time grain consultant who was 67 years old and had been out of the commercial game for a decade, a man named Harold Fink, who had worked for a co-op for 30 years and who charged half what the credentialed specialist charged and who Marcus found through Elias. He started maintaining paper records alongside his digital monitoring, not because paper was better, but because the act of writing down the readings forced a different kind of attention than glancing at a screen. He started driving out to Elias's farm every few months, not for any specific reason, but because he had realized that the education available in a Mahaska County shop was not available anywhere else, and that he had almost missed it entirely. Elias Greer died in March of 2023 at the age of 81 in the house he had lived in for 52 years. His funeral in Oskaloosa had 200 people in attendance, which was remarkable for a man who had never sought any kind of recognition and who most people in the broader agriculture community had never heard of. David Greer inherited the farm and the 3 bins and the shop full of fabricated equipment, including the extraction rig, which David continued to maintain with the same meticulous care his father had brought to it. He ran the farm the same way his father had run it, not because the methods were the only possible methods, but because they worked, and because David had been watching them work his entire life. Let me tell you one last thing, because it is the reason this story is still told. In the fall of 2024, a younger grain operator in Wapello County, a 31-year-old named Tyler Marsh, who had started his storage business in 2021 and who had expanded aggressively on the same logic Marcus had used 6 years earlier, found himself with compromised grain, an attorney on the phone, and a set of options that did not include any good ones. He had heard the story about Marcus and Elias. Everyone in the county had heard the story about Marcus and Elias. But hearing a story and believing in it are different things. And Tyler Marsh had grown up in an era of precision agriculture and satellite yield monitoring and AI-driven commodity forecasting. And the idea that the answer to his problem was a hand-built extraction rig on an old man's farm was not the first place his mind went. Marcus Del Vecchio drove over to Tyler Marsh's facility on a Wednesday, uninvited, the same way Elias had driven to his. He looked at the temperature cables. He asked about the CO2 readings. He stood in the equipment shed and looked at Tyler's drying system and asked 3 or 4 questions about airflow and plenum pressure. Then he said, "I know someone you need to call." Tyler said, "Who?" Marcus said, "David Greer, Mahaska County. He's got a piece of equipment that doesn't look like much and works on principles they stopped teaching in the certification programs 30 years ago. You'll think it's a joke when you see it. Call him anyway." Tyler said, "Is it going to be faster than my system?" DeMarcus looked at him with an expression that Elias Greer would have recognized. He said, "It's going to work on the problem you actually have instead of the problem your equipment was designed for. That's not the same as fast." There was a silence. Tyler Marsh called David Greer that afternoon. David Greer arrived the next morning with the extraction rig on a flatbed trailer, and it was not impressive to look at. Fabricated steel, pipe fittings, a blower housing that had been repainted at least twice, a dolly system that had been welded and re-welded with the confidence of a man who had fixed things many times and expected to fix them again. Tyler's 2 employees looked at it and said nothing in a way that communicated something. David ran pressure tests on the intake manifold, that he made adjustments using measurements from the bin drawings he had asked for the day before. He sat on the tailgate of his truck and drew a diagram on graph paper, the same kind of graph paper, the same red-covered notebook, showing exactly what the device would pull and from where and why the surrounding mass would not migrate into the extraction zone if they maintained the right differential pressure. The words were almost the same as the words his father had used in 2019, because the physics were the same, and because David had been watching his father use them since he was old enough to stand next to a bin and hold a sample bag. Tyler Marsh's grain was salvaged. Not all of it. Nothing is ever all of it, but enough. Enough to meet his contracts. Enough to keep his operation whole. Enough to matter. Some things are not built to be sold. Some things are built to solve a specific problem with the right tool in the right hands at the right moment, and they get passed from father to son along with the red notebook and the measurements and the years of understanding that no certification program offers and no commercial system has ever found a way to sell back to the people who need it most. The specialists will tell you about throughput. The dealers will tell you about capacity. The attorneys will tell you about risk, and then the grain will be compromised, and the options will run out, and someone will pull off a county road and ask to see the temperature cables, and everything will depend on whether you have the humility to let them in. The extraction rig is still in the shop in Mahaska County. David runs it twice a year to keep the seals from setting. He replaced one fitting in 2022 and the blower housing gasket in 2023 and otherwise has touched nothing his father touched. The co-ops say the technology is obsolete. The precision agriculture vendors say the monitoring systems have made these approaches unnecessary. David Greer runs the rig anyway, because obsolete is a word that people use for things they've stopped needing. And there is a difference between stopping needing something and not needing it anymore. A difference that every man who has stood at a bin gate with compromised grain and no good options understands in a way that's very hard to